So today is June 5th, which is World Environment Day, and this year's theme for World Environment Day is Only One Earth. I thought it would be apt for us to do a landscape painting together today, so that's what this video is going to be. Hi there, welcome back to the channel. My name is Shivani and I'm an artist and entrepreneur based in the sunny city of Chennai in the south of India. So I'm also the founder of a sustainable accessories brand called Archer, which I've linked to in the description. So World Environment Day has always been something that we've spoken about in our company and celebrated every year. This year, since I've started this YouTube channel, which is now such a huge part of my life, I wanted to bring this community into those celebrations as well. So what I'm painting today is inspired by a Dutch tulip field. Since I was anyway going to do this painting, I thought this would be the perfect occasion for me to record the process and show it to you guys. Hopefully you'll be able to learn a little bit from it as well. And there's going to be a bit of layering with gouache in this, so it's going to be pretty interesting. So let's dive straight into it. So for today's painting, like I said, I'm doing a landscape, which is a tulip field, and I'm pulling up a reference image on the screen for you to see what it's going to look like. And in terms of the materials I'll be using, I have my waste piece of cloth here. I've got my paints, which is Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache. I've got my brushes, which are Princeton brushes. I have my water jar and a ceramic palette. I'm going to start off by painting the sky and we'll proceed from there. So to paint the sky, I'm using a mix of primary blue and ultramarine along with permanent white. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you will know that my motto with gouache is to always be swatching. So that's what I'm doing here, just testing out the colors to make sure I've got them right before going into my painting with them. I'm just making a few adjustments, adding in a bit more of ultramarine to get a darker tone, and that's what I'll start off with. I'm going to be creating a gradient where I move from the upper part of the sky being the darkest to it getting lighter as I move towards the bottom. So as you can see, I'm just adding in a little white as I keep going downwards. And wherever I feel it necessary, I'm just adjusting the color a bit or going over it with a little more white and blending that in. Once I've laid out all the colors for the sky, I just use a damp brush and sometimes pick up a bit of color on my brush to just go over it, and I'm just lightly brushing it back and forth to sort of blend the various zones of the sky together. I'm trying to get as smooth a gradient as possible. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that when you're working with gouache, it often appears very different when it's wet as compared to when it's dry. So you'll see in this part where I'm adding in wet paint, it suddenly looks really light in comparison to the color around it, but that's just because it's wet and you don't need to worry about this. If you're ever worried, don't keep going over the same area again and again. Just wait until it dries and you'll get a better picture of how it actually looks. And another important thing to keep in mind is to not keep going over the same area too many times or to put too much pressure on your brush because you don't want to lift up too much paint. Now that this is done, I'm going to move on to the field where I'll be using green mainly. There'll be different shades of green here and I'll be using it quite watery in fact, because I'll be building the layers over it and I'll be painting the flowers over the base layer of green. The only parts that I will keep darker and not so watery are the sort of pathways in between the different flowers. So you can see that in the reference image here. These pathways are a lot more deep and dark and they are purely green. So I'll keep my color more creamy there. For this, I'm going to be using mixes of permanent green middle, permanent yellow deep and spectrum red. Red is the complementary color of green, so you will find that when you add a bit of red into your green, it immediately deepens the tone a lot, and that gives you a very dark foresty kind of green. So I like mixing it that way instead of mixing black into my colors, because you get much richer colors this way. So I'm first just creating those pathways between the flower beds like I spoke about, and for the in-between area I'm keeping my paint more watery, and you'll be able to notice the difference once it dries. Right now it's wet, so it looks almost the same color as what I mentioned as the creamy one, but once it dries you'll see that this is a little more transparent. And I'm continuing the same way in the different sections. As you would have noticed in the reference image, the color is a lot more dark towards the center, and then the green gets lighter and brighter as we move upwards towards the horizon. So that's how I'm picking my colors as well. I'm starting to mix in some of the permanent yellow deep to get slightly brighter shades of green. And now as the portions are drying, like I mentioned, you would be able to notice the parts which are more watery than the other parts. If you'd like to know more about the different consistencies of gouache and how to understand them and get them right, I'm linking to one of my previous videos about gouache consistency above, which I think you'll find really helpful. Start painting the windmill which you see at the horizon, and for this I'm using some burnt umber along with yellow ochre. For the darkest portion, which is on the right, I'm using more of the burnt umber, and then as I move to the left I'm just adding bits of yellow ochre to lighten it. Trying to create a kind of metallic shade of blue. So I'm using the blue that's already mixed on my palette and adding a bit of this ochre mix to it to get that kind of earthy and metallic look. I'm pulling up the reference image once again just so you know exactly what I'm going after. Start painting the trees and bushes at the horizon. I'm just varying the shades of green that I'm using to add some dimension to it. and in the portion on the left, I'm even mixing in some blue with the green to give it this perception of depth. In hindsight though, I wouldn't have painted these areas before I finished the clouds. If you're following along with me or trying to create something similar, I would recommend painting the clouds first. That just makes it a lot easier. I'll be painting the clouds a little later, but yeah, that was something I should have probably done at this stage before painting the horizon. I'm now going to start mixing up the colors for the flowers that I'm going to be painting. And to create color harmony in my painting, I'm actually going to play around with just 2 colors and create a whole range of shades from them. So I started with brilliant red violet, which I left as is. I then mixed it with a bit of primary yellow to create a very reddish shade. And then I mixed it with even more primary yellow to make it more orange, and then I have primary yellow by itself. And now what you see me painting is brilliant red violet mixed with just permanent white. And then I'll add in all the different shades in the different parts of the field. Turning the book around because it's just easier sometimes to be dragging the brush towards myself. Sometimes when my paint is drying on my palette, I just use a spray bottle to spray on some water to keep it moist. Once I'm done painting all the flower beds in the portions where I had left the paper white, I'm then going to start building up on my green layers. So the parts where I have given an underpainting of green, I'm going to now start building up over that. To create these flowers, I'm sort of doing a stippling technique with my brush, and I'm creating bigger or wider strokes for the flowers which are closer to the viewer. And as we move further behind or towards the horizon, I'm making my strokes not just smaller but also closer together, so they're more clustered. Whereas the parts which are closer to the viewer, I keep them a little more apart so you're able to see more green between them. And I hope that makes sense, but you can see what I'm doing even if I'm not doing a great job of explaining it. The beauty of gouache is when it's drying, that's sometimes just so satisfying to watch. And like when you're laying the paint onto your paper, like I said before, it looks so different when it's wet. So when you're putting your paint onto the paper, especially when you're layering it over another color, it sometimes looks as if it's transparent, but as it dries, you'll see that it's actually very rich and opaque, as long as you're using it in that perfect creamy consistency, for which I would again recommend that you watch my video on gouache consistency if you haven't watched it before. And if you want to know more about working with gouache and watch more in-depth tutorials, then I would highly recommend checking out my gouache playlist with all my tutorials, which I'm linking to above as well as in the description. Done with the first phase of these flowers, and before I move on to shading them, I'm just going to go back to my sky because it's now completely dried, and I'm going to paint my clouds. So for this I'll be using a dry brushing technique. So earlier when I started painting the flowers, I had switched over to my round brush, and that's the same brush that I'll be using to paint the clouds. So I'll just remove all the excess paint from my brush and then remove all the excess moisture. So I just want my brush to be damp so that it's not completely dry, but at the same time I don't want it to be carrying any extra water because I want to be able to create dry brush strokes. So I'll dip that into the paint which I've freshly taken out of the tube, and then I'll start creating these dry brush strokes on the sky. Again, here, similar to what I mentioned with the blending, make sure you're not overworking any part of it. You need to just create your strokes and let them be. If you keep going over the same area multiple times, what you'll find is that it starts blending with the base layer, because gouache can be reactivated with any sort of moisture. So you don't want to be reactivating your base layer, you just want to brush over it. In some parts, I'm kind of intentionally reactivating my base blue to create these blue undertones. I'm now creating the fans of the windmill, and there's this portion of the fan which is kind of transparent. So for this I'm just using very watered down paint to kind of create a glaze, and that gives me this effect of transparency. So this is very similar to how you'd use something like watercolor, but with gouache you're able to layer it. And then I'll just create the windows of the windmill. Mixing up darker shades for each of the floral beds, and I'm just adding some shadows, and later I'll add highlights as well. So the painting is complete now, and I actually unfortunately lost a little bit of the footage where I was just finishing up the details. I was actually a little unsatisfied with how the flowers turned out, so I went in and covered up some of my shading. I think I overdid the shading a bit, so it was looking a little unnatural, so I went in and just covered up some of that with more of the base color and just added a few highlights. And then I also added a bit of shading here to add some depth. So if you can see these little curved lines that I've added, and then just sort of blended it together, and also some here. I added a bit of dark detailing here as well. And that's all. I finished it up that way, and I'm actually happy with how it turned out, but I feel like it could have been a little bit better. I'm not completely satisfied, and to be honest, so I'm recording this portion of the video a day after I recorded all the previous parts which you already watched, and for the entire one day in between, I was just contemplating whether to scrap this video entirely and not publish it because I wasn't so happy. But it's okay. I also want to show you guys the paintings that I'm not completely happy with, and that's the whole point of having a sketchbook. It's my room for experimentation and just, trying things out even if they don't turn out perfect. And I always tell my students when I do physical workshops that sometimes when you're looking at your paintings up close, they may not feel perfect, but take a step back and then suddenly they look a lot better. So that's what I did as well. So I just kind of looked at it from a distance and I suddenly realized that it's not as bad as I thought. Maybe it didn't turn out exactly how I pictured it, but it's still very pretty. As always, all the materials that I used are linked in the description, and I'm also adding my discount code which you can use to avail 10% off when you shop at Hindustan Trading Company, and they have everything you could possibly need to get started on your gouache journey. And I've also curated some gouache kits along with them, which I'll link to as well. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. If you aren't familiar with me already, I put out content every single week that helps you improve your skills as a gouache painter and also improve your productivity and efficiency as a creative business owner. If those are topics that interest you, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel below. It would mean the world to me. I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, take care and bye.